Hello and welcome to Daily Sceptic's Weekly Podcast. Well, so you'll notice that today I'm not in our studio as usual. I'm at the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship Conference, the ARC conference here in East London at the Excel Centre. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Ben Sixsmith, who's the online editor of the Critic and a friend of the show. And so plenty to discuss today, Ben. But this is the third day of the conference. And so, and you've obviously flown from Poland, which is where you live, so you know you're not always here. How have you found the conference in general? What stood out to you?
It's been a very interesting conference so far. Many more delegates than I expected. Mm-hmm. Many more people. I think there's at least 4,000 people who've attended from around the world. We've got guests from the United States, from Australia, from Asia. I always feel like the Englishmen among us have been outnumbered by this sea of right-leaning people who've come in from their various homelands and with their various tendencies, their various political tendencies. So it's been interesting to share ideas, to share perspectives. And I think generally with conferences, including this one, the most interesting times to be had are outside of the auditorium when you're meeting people, when you're catching up with people, and then the speeches for all of their merits, like almost the excuse to make those connections. So for me, the highlight has been reconnecting with people and then building new relationships. But also we've seen some interesting speeches, some of them interesting for their merits, some of them interesting for their demerits. But it's been a very stimulating few days.
Yes, and so of course the highest number of delegates were British there. We learned that on the first day. But as you mentioned, this question in what kinds of conservatism are being brought from around the world to here, and it's almost a little bit strange to think that this is where apparently a hub for conservatives, because actually the state of conservatism in Britain at the moment maybe leaves a bit to be desired. And that brings us on to someone who I know you and the Critic as well has been generally pretty critical of, and that's Kemi Badenoch. She's having a bit of a difficult time at the moment. But what did you make of her speech, which was I think it was the first speech of the whole conference actually, on that first day? What did you make of it?
I think it was one of her strongest speeches in delivery and in content. I did like her emphasis on the kind of cultural and political weakness that's been inculcated in Western Europe and in Britain specifically. I thought it was a good theme to hit upon, the kind of weakness where we lack a kind of confidence in ourselves and in our ability to change politics and to change culture for the better, both the people outside of power, so us more leaning to the right, and even the government itself and the people who are attracted to there. They have a kind of lack of confidence in the country they're meant to be representing, where it's something that needs to be constrained and repressed more than something that needs to be represented and promoted. But specifically on the right-leaning end of the sphere, I thought the weakness of her speech was she was kind of emphasizing that these classical liberal values are very much under threat and we need to stand up and represent them and defend them and promote them, which is certainly true to some extent. I mean, we are obviously advocates of freedom in many of its diverse senses, but it lacked any sense of embracing, defending, promoting Britain as a kind of specific entity. Because if you're just going to define a nation by its values, then any nation really could be a representative of those values, whether it's Britain or whether it's Bhutan. And as well as those values, we also have to appreciate and respect and conserve and promote what makes us specifically British or specifically American or specifically Australian, and the kind of concrete cultural heritage and political heritage and just generally national heritage that has been developed organically or otherwise throughout many hundreds of years, and not just since John Stuart Mill thought, it would be a good idea to write a book about freedom. So that kind of emphasis on ideals and not local specificity, I thought was a big limitation of her speech, because it made it kind of unmoored from any sense of Britain as a specific nation.
Yeah, because it can be quite abstract, this concept, right? And I know you've written about, in a previous speech, actually along similar lines, talk about muscular liberalism, and this sort of does sound like, it's more assertive, it's more dynamic, but as I think you were writing about then, this is not really a particularly new idea. This is something that David Cameron really was saying almost a decade ago. So it's not anything new, for one thing, but it's also perhaps not reckoning with the fact that the moment that we're in as a country, and I suppose for the right internationally as well, is quite transformative and dynamic, as we're seeing in America.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was almost like she was seeing this conference as such a multinational event that we shouldn't focus on any sense of national specificity, but really we should be enjoying and appreciating the diversity of our national specificities. So we can say, this is something that's specifically British, this is something that's specifically American, this is something that's specifically Australian. Let's all enjoy these things while acknowledging the differences between them. And like you say, it's a very old and maybe redundant concept. In America, we can see that the new Republican government have this very optimistic and ambitious sense of Americanness specifically. J.D. Vance was speaking in the Munich Security Conference about, American interests and European interests. And here it seems we're still stuck in this kind of amorphous liberalism where everyone pretends that culture is just something that can be transplanted between nations and it doesn't have any kind of sense of rootedness.
And so we'll get onto the geopolitical implications of that speech and the Russia, Ukraine and everything else in a second. But of course, one of the things that J.D. Vance mentioned partly in passing in that speech, was a key point, was the erosion of free speech in Europe. And in particular, he mentioned Britain. He mentioned the case of a man who fell foul of our ridiculously authoritarian abortion buffer zone laws. And this has been an ongoing problem, but that's not the only free speech problem we have in Britain at the moment. But it's interesting, isn't it? We've been, for a long time, there's been a great importance placed on what is called Britain's international reputation. And generally this is talked up by people who care an enormous amount about international law and other things like that. And yet, really, now that the power balance has very much shifted in America, I think partly, but for other reasons as well, the way we're seen by someone like Vance, who's giving, this speech that's being heard around the world, is as this kind of tin pot dictatorship which locks people up. And then, of course, the other thing is the grooming gang scandal, which has now also gone worldwide. I mean, that's an astonishing fact that this is how we're being seen abroad now.
Yeah, it's tremendous irony, really, because Keir Starmer and his Labour government have put this huge emphasis on soft power, the idea that we can kind of project Britain's cultural image as a force for attracting people, attracting investment, attracting international goodwill. And yet we've seen in the very few months that he's been in power an incredible decline in Britain's international image, especially, obviously, on the right. We have this freedom of speech crisis. And I mean, the example that J.D. Vance raised is not even freedom of speech, it's freedom of thought, because this man was silently praying in his head, or at least was accused of silently praying in his head. What a crime that is. So we've somehow left the realms of restricting speech, which is, goodness knows, bad enough in itself, and we've embraced the realm of restricting people's ability to think, which understandably, I mean, America, the land of the free, they have the First Amendment, and it's no surprise that they look on that with horror. We had the grooming gang scandal, which obviously is looking back to events which have happened in the recent past, as well as tragically events that appear to be ongoing now, and emerged online and were seized upon by Mr. Musk in America with, he had a grudge with Keir Starmer. I'm not going to claim there wasn't a certain amount of opportunism there, but you can see from how quickly it shot throughout the internet in the UK and abroad, just what a horror it was. These events which British people have kind of taken for granted, like we had a sense that it was happening, but we also had a sense that, it was quite local and people went to jail and it's all been sorted out now. But as these horrific details have emerged, and the scale, not just of the crimes themselves, but of the corruption and the neglect that went into the failure to address them, has seen the shock and horror that should have been felt and experienced and addressed decades ago is now being addressed is now being experienced across the world. So this ambition of Britain's soft power, rather than advancing British interests, we're seeing quite the reverse happen, where Britain is increasingly being seen as a rather something of a cautionary tale about the downfall of societies when they embrace this kind of managerial progressivism that I think Starmer was seeing as maybe his calling card.
And I think particularly with Elon Musk having now taken over X, the sort of pipeline between that information being out there online and to really some of the most powerful people in the world has become very, very short indeed. So J.D. Vance is, he's only 10 or so, maybe 10 or 15 years older than both of us. And he's the first kind of probably online vice president we've ever had. He's sort of he replied last week to Sceptic guest Eugippius, which was quite an interesting one, to have our commentators being at that level of influence. But the point being that, these kind of stories are being transmitted around the world much more swiftly than they were. And obviously Elon Musk is involved in that too. But I know, in fact, the Critic played a key role in doing that with the grooming gangs towards the end of December, actually, it was. And will just tell us about what happened there and how that really went global.
Yeah, there's a marvellous kind of butterfly effect that can happen online. So Fraser Nelson had written an article talking up the joys of multiculturalism and how, you can have an Egyptian football player who celebrates Christmas, and doesn't this prove that we've reached this kind of diverse utopia? And then our wonderful contributor Sam Bidwell wrote an article responding to him. And through the discourse that emerged from that article, it came to Elon Musk's attention that there'd been this terrible scandal. There was also, I should mention, a completely anonymous account on Twitter called Max Tempers, who'd posted a section from the court documents which detailed a particularly appalling case which also caught Musk's attention. And these two very small data points managed to mutate into this international scandal, which I think should give us a lot of optimism that the small things we do and say online, they can have at least an effect within the international discourse. Obviously, it remains to be seen whether this leads to any kind of material changes. I don't want to get ahead of myself and suggest that we can just tweet ourselves to political triumphs, but it at least can change the conversation in a way that we hope we can build on in a more material sense. So the kind of omerta that you'd get in the British media in the past is what I called it a conspiracy of whispering, where there were these things that we could kind of talk about, but in a very calculated and muted sense so that nobody would, feel too strongly about them.
Yeah.
They can break through this kind of media muttering and receive the attention and the emotion that they deserve.
Yes, and to go into a vexed and maybe somewhat technical point, but it's important on that, getting the attention they deserve there. So there's the question of how do you refer to it? Is it grooming gangs, or is it the rape gangs, or is it indeed the Pakistani rape gangs, or some one of those? Where do you land on that? And I suppose, what do you think of the significance is of the kind of changing way that people are starting to refer to it?
I mean, it is a word game. And I think perhaps people within the media attract a little bit too much significance to what do we call this? I mean, it is true that grooming, is not necessarily, doesn't have negative connotations. If I walk past groomers for dogs, it's not like I look at it and I think, what the hell are they doing in there? We've got to get the police involved. But I do think when you appreciate that, as it does, grooming refers to exploiting the emotions and the bodies of young women, I think, for me, at least, the word has such a repulsive, just disgusting connotations that I think it's quite emotive enough. And I think we can kind of all understand that it refers to rape, but it refers to a kind of rape where young, vulnerable women, many of them in care homes or in foster homes, were not just kind of seized off the street, which is one particularly appalling crime, but were involved in a different appalling crime where they were kind of drawn into this web of criminality, where in the beginning they would be flattered, or many of them, I shouldn't say all of them, but many of them would be flattered and kind of treated as if they were this older man's girlfriend, and then drawn into this hideous crime. So personally, I don't want to say it's a good word, because it's a horrific word, but personally I think it's fairly accurate terminology. And I mean, I think it's how most people have encountered it, and I think most people, at least in recent months, have had the appropriate reaction. So I'm sure that there will be cases where the name of a phenomenon is grossly inadequate. But I think in this case, it's almost a kind of marginal commentator's issue that doesn't affect how the average reader or viewer is gonna perceive the case.
But so, of course, this did break massively into the news in the past month, and this obviously connects to the major issue, certainly the biggest issue on the British right at the moment, which is immigration. And, well, there's been sort of some coverage of that, I think, at this conference, but perhaps it's more partly explained by the fact that it's more American-oriented, but that hasn't really been front and center in the past few days. Do you think, I think most notably, it wasn't even one of the questions in the interview with Farage, in particular, and I think Badenoch mentioned it a bit, but not that much. But so is there a danger of kind of keep delaying as I get off the ball on that?
Oh yeah, I think there is. Maybe it's because we bring so many people from so many places. It's like people are trying to look at the issues that connect us, and so the specifically European problem with mass migration, maybe they're worried it would seem kind of too unfamiliar to American audiences or to Asian or to Australian, African audiences. I mean, I don't think that's true. Obviously, across the world, we have different migration crises which have different elements involved, but they also return to these questions of human rights or economics. So it's definitely something we should be talking more about. I don't know if maybe Farage wanted to kind of show his breadth. He's coming to this kind of intellectual/ideological conference, and he didn't want to be seen to be, too much fulfilling the leftist gammon stereotypes. So he wanted to talk about energy or something. But certainly it's a mistake when, Trump would not have been elected without this issue. Governments across Europe would not have been unseated without this issue. Political parties would not be rising without this issue. Whatever you think about it, whatever your opinion is got to be in one of the top, among the top political issues of our time. So it has been oddly neglected maybe throughout the conference, and that's definitely something to be addressed in future events of this kind.
But that, of course, reminds us of another split between the American right and the British, or maybe the British state, I suppose, but America and Britain broadly, is that also that, there are some deportations that the Starmer government is, trying to show off, and they're sort of it's even striking from the images. I think we'll put some up at this point, but basically you see, for us, we have 4 or 5 high-vis guards per deportee, and in fact the numbers are not very, very great. Whereas in America, it's basically they're all just being loaded onto a military plane, and this kind of signifies that they're doing it they're much more gung-ho about it. They're much more just saying, we're going to do this, and we're not going to listen to anyone. Then, of course, America is not part of the ECHR. Is one minor footnote in that, but that's relevant. Why is America so able to do that and we aren't?
It's a strange new Labour tactic. I find it quite. I don't want to do the kind of left of the real racists. I find it quite unpleasant, really, the way they're kind of showing off these deportations, which should be just a fairly normal matter of statecraft. When there are people in your country who don't have the right to be there, you remove them, but you don't need to kind of jump up and down about it and be like, we got rid of this guy. It's it is quite a sad thing to be doing. It's a necessary thing to be doing, but it's a strange thing for them to be celebrating. I think the difference between America and Europe, partly it's just because we had the right-wing government in power, and they completely wasted every opportunity and indeed doubled down on very bad policies from the previous Labour government. And the difference now with the right-wing government in the USA is it's not been prey to this kind of ideological capture by the leftist managerial establishment. It's just symbolic of the failure of the Conservatives more than anything about Labour Party.
Well, it shows that you can get a lot done if you actually say, well, we can do things, right? They're not, the left in America are complaining. They're saying, this is what all the words is racist, is whatever else. And yet they're saying, I don't care. I'm in government. I'm going to do whatever I like. That's a lesson for the British right.
Absolutely. Trump has got, and his allies have got an astonishing amount done in a very short amount of time. And it does expose these kind of conservative protestations, these appeals to, well, we can't do this because of this law, or we can't do this because of this court, or we can't do this because of how it's going to look, to be the kind of impotent babbling that it should have always been recognized as being. And you have to wonder to what extent these kind of this kind of reasoning was always just an excuse for not wanting to do things. So I think we should be very intolerant of politicians who are appealing to their inability to do things when, in many cases at least, it's not an inability to do something, it's just an excuse for not doing something. It's kind of, I can't go to work because I've got a headache. Do you really have a headache? Or did you just have one too many beers the night before and you really don't feel like it?
Indeed. And of course, one of the ways that is put in here in Britain in particular is that we must not at any point ever violate international law. That's the idea, and other courts as well and things. But I mean, what America is doing at the moment, partly with this immigration agenda, I suppose, but also generally, it's kind of blowing up the liberal international order as it's been for a very long time. And are the scales, surely they're going to have to fall from the eyes of the types of people in Britain who still say, we can't do this because, we have to listen to this advisory opinion about Chagos, whatever it is, when it's just, some ideologically motivated person in the court that has no actual power. Are we ever going to wake up and realize we don't really have to listen to these things?
I think so. I mean, if you look at the tone of the Rory Stewarts and Alistair Campbells of this world, there's this embattled siege mentality where they're getting more and more hysterical, but I think they appreciate that the constituency they're appealing to is not anymore a kind of majority or an established elite consensus. It is a community of depressed, middle-aged Lib Dem voters. And it is, this is a mentality we're going to have to step over. And that easily, as has been demonstrated, can be stepped over. Not because there's not, obviously when we talk about international law, there is a sense in which we should have global rules governing conduct when it comes to, when it comes to torture, when it comes to war crimes. But when it comes to these things, which should very much be the purview of individual nations, we do need to establish a new consensus which says, actually, this organization of completely unelected globalists does not have the right to tell this country why something it's been doing for hundreds and hundreds of years is suddenly off the table.
So, of course, the other way that the Trump administration is, taking apart what had been a fairly settled consensus for at least a couple of years was that, the West must back Ukraine and must give continuous arms to it, things like this, and that we should, any kind of ceasefire negotiated that basically gave up any of Ukraine would be a terrible thing. And more or less, America is saying, well, no, that's going to have to be peace now. And they're also similarly doing it above Ukraine's head. Let's talk about the geopolitics in a second. But I suppose firstly, there was the J.D. Vance speech where he's kind of at the Munich Security Conference where he's making this clear to the Eurocrat elites. And, well, it's fair to say they didn't take it well.
Yeah, absolutely. He delivered some home truths. They didn't like to hear them. It's another symptom of this hysterical tone among the English managerialists is this idea that he was insulting Europe when he was quite clearly insulting Europe's leaders, at least from where his perspective in defense of Europe. Obviously, you don't have to agree with him on that. But he wasn't insulting Europeans. He was insulting the heads of these organizations and, in my opinion, saying things which were entirely true about free speech, about migration, and also just about how, if they dislike him so much and they dislike Trump so much, that's fine. That's an opinion which can be defended. But the fact that they're so reliant on the USA militarily, institutionally, that they've become such a negative phenomenon. I mean, what were you doing that you had to rely on us so much? It was a real wake-up call, or should have been a real wake-up call, in the sense that how did they not see this coming? How did they not see that one day there would be an American government which wasn't prepared to act as this kind of outsider force swooping in to sort everything out with its greater resources? How is it that Europe doesn't have armies which can stand up? In theory, at least, Europe itself should be able to stand up to Russia. We have more people, we have more money, we have more, historic and traditionally established institutions. Why are we relying on the USA? So I thought that was a very necessary moment. And I don't think it is going to wake up those particular leaders who were crying over his speech, but hopefully it's going to wake up people beneath them to realize that we need new leadership, which can more effectively represent Europe. And it was maybe not a nice speech to hear, but it was, I think, a bracing dunk in the metaphorical cold water.
But I mean, it seems like for now, certainly Keir Starmer, if he's got anything to say about it, he's going to try and keep it going. You're talking about potentially deploying British troops to Ukraine for peacekeeping and things like this, and he's notably been rebuffed by the Polish and others too, I think. Well, what do you make of that? I mean, it's not really going to be sustainable, is it? Well, when's the penny going to drop?
No, I mean, it has to. I live in Poland. I'm very proud to be a resident of Poland. And Poland has been a major backer of Ukraine for very obvious contemporary and historical reasons. But its leaders also appear to have a sense of what's realistic and what's too dangerous to attempt to achieve. And Keir Starmer is talking about British troops in Ukraine, and you almost have to just ask the simple question, what troops? Like, what is the state of the British army that we can act as if we're still this major global power when, we're selling off our overseas territories, we have done basically nothing with the armed forces, and now we're going to behave as if the empire is back. It's a very purblind attitude and hubristic attitude to take towards world affairs.
And of course, the other question that issue of potential deployment has raised in the past week or so is whether we actually have a populace who would be willing to go and fight. And, there was stats coming out saying that, a tiny proportion of the relevant age group actually would be. And, what do you make of that? And, in some ways, it's not really that surprising given various things what it's like to be, someone of our age, really, living in Britain or a British citizen, at least. At the moment, it's almost unsurprising.
The writer Clement Knox wrote a very good piece for us at the Critic this week about how a strong state, which Starmer aspires to have, depends on a strong nation, because it needs to, in many cases, it needs to draw upon the support of the people. And Britain, as a nation which has a sense of itself, a sense of its goodness, a sense of its purpose, has been diminished to, as you say, the point where young people wouldn't even represent it. This is a huge failure of the political elites. And we can reduce that to a number of issues, the treatment of the young, obviously, not just by Starmer's government, but obviously by the Conservative government before that. They can't even own a literal piece of the nation. There's very few young people, or comparatively few young people, who are able to afford property. If you can't even own your own home, how invested are you going to feel in the future of the nation? People have fewer kids, again. How invested are you going to feel in the future of the nation? People don't really have anything to identify with culturally, spiritually, to use spirit in a metaphorical sense. And I guess, it's sad. I would like to think, even as an expat, if Britain called upon me, I'd be willing to do my duty. If Poland did, I hope I'd be willing to do my duty there. But I can't blame young people, really, for saying, well, what is this country doing for me? What does this country mean to me? And it's a sad thing to appreciate, but it's something that has to be appreciated because God knows it's not going to change just by lecturing them about how much more responsible and patriotic they should be when the same people who are in power haven't been giving them any reason to be responsible or patriotic.
I suppose finally, dire as things seem in many ways, there's this great phrase from Schumpeter, which is creative destruction. Could that be a dynamic that we're seeing here where, yes, Starmer's government is already extremely unpopular. We've had all these social problems that we've been talking about already. And of course, reform now are topping the polls. Is this sort of dire as it seems a potentially transformational moment for British politics in the next few years?
I hope so. I like to think so. Who knows how it's going to shape up? As I say at this conference, we have very diverse perspectives. On Ukraine, for example, I've spoken to people who are, firm America First isolationists, and then I've spoken to Ukrainian politicians who've served on the front lines. So there's lots of different perspectives coming together that we may or may not sympathize with. But there's a tremendous space being opened up in British culture as well as abroad for new ideas. Starmer's government, as I've said on this program before, is so bereft of imagination. It's so managerial in its sense that everything can be reduced to procedure and just what's the right way to do things, that people are not going to be attached to it because there's nothing to be attached to. and people are going to look for new ideas for the future, new vision, new personalities for the future, obviously. And there is going to be a lot of space for people who want to seize that. How we're going to feel about them is a question that's going to be determined, but it's going to happen one way or another.
Absolutely. Okay, well, with that, Ben Sixsmith, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.